What's up, Warhams? It's time for Warhamming. In this episode, I'm going to be showing you how to turn this into this. So we're going to take a look at more traditional bases first before we start getting into our urban bases. So the traditional base that Games Workshop tends to put in all their codexes and box art involves a fine sand around the base to be your main texture. They then break it up with bits of rock and grass to add some color and break up the monotony of it. So how do we achieve these basic functions while doing an urban base? Most urban bases, we're not going to have grass or the varying colors that painting dirt provides. Most things in an urban setting are going to be gray and monochromatic. That being said, our current objective is trying to achieve contrast. But how do we achieve that contrast? That'll be revealed later in this video. The first material we're working with is this thin cork paper. It just peels off the back like that, and you can get it at any craft store. So we'll be starting out by placing our base face down on this cork paper, and we'll grab our hobby knife and we'll carve a circle around the base. Very careful not to cut the side of the base. If your knife is extremely sharp like mine, it will slice through the side and leave an awful gash. So now that we've got that cut out, we will add some super glue to the base. You don't want to go overboard with the super glue because it'll pop out of the sides, and we will use this popsicle stick to spread it around. So once we get the back peeled off the cork paper, we will stick it to the base itself. So the cork paper is sticky, but I just want to be extra sure my cork won't come off the base. So now we have our road texture. We will be adding some fine sand mixed with some pebbles to add a ruined texture to our what is right now pristine road. We will also be using wood to bring in some browns and some yellows. We're also going to be using this razor wire to add some shinier elements and to break up the different shades of gray. The key is to keep the base exciting, but not so exciting that it draws the eye away from the miniature itself. What we're trying to do here is enhance, not distract. So our next step is going to be cutting more off the cork paper, but at random intervals, to stack on top of itself and create more texture. So what I'm doing is I'm ripping off parts so that it's got more jagged edges and it's not square and at right angles. So we're just going to glue this to the top of our basic road texture. I'm kind of placing these intermittently and on top of each other. So now with all of these placed, I'm going to come back at it with my hobby knife and start cutting at roughly 45-degree angles, or at least enough of an angle to cut all of the pieces I've stacked on top of each other. The reason I'm doing this is to make it sloped and not stepped, giving it a more natural look and less of a purposeful stacking. So now we can look at it like that so you can see the effect. So now we're going to be using our sand as our rubble effect for these stacks of asphalt. And what we're using it for is blending these stacks of asphalt and making it more rubbly. So what I'm doing is I'm just adding a little bit of super glue around each stack and then sprinkling some sand and some pebbles into the glue, and then knocking off any excess into this lower dish. So now that we're done with our sand, we're going to move on to our wood effects, and I'm just using these wire cutters to mangle up some of this wood. So you need to be really careful when adding objects to bases, because a lot of the times they can be way too big in scale. Pebbles can be huge boulders compared to their feet, and little bits of wood can be massive pieces of lumber. So try to think of it at their scale. So the most common piece of wood used in building and stuff seems to be the 2x4, so I'm going for a wood that's about that size. And all I'm doing is cutting it and gluing it to the base with super glue. So now we'll be moving on to the razor wire. And one trick I like to do is I like to spool it around something round, kind of to resemble the razor wire that gets put on top of fences. So once you wrap it around, you just nip it with the wire cutters, pull it off, give it a little bit of a stretch and fluff it up, make it look more natural, like it's fallen off of a anti-infantry obstacle. And then all you need to do is glue it onto the base. So now the construction side of our base is finished. It's a little hard to see the details at this point in time, but that'll all get fixed in the painting section. So all I've done here is attached my base to a wooden block with some fun tack so that my fingers don't get in the way while I'm painting. So now we need to prime. So for priming the base, you can use a spray-on primer, you can use paint-on primer. I'm personally going to use paint-on primer because that's just happens to be what I've got on hand in white. Paint-on primer I'm using is just the Vallejo surface primer. It's nice and watered down since it's meant to go into airbrushes. The reason I'm using white primer is because I want the gray that we're going to paint this base to be brighter than if I undercoated it with black. So for priming, it's important to get everything covered so that you kind of seal everything in, cover up any of the glue blobs, and really lock in all that gravel that we've glued to the base. It's important to get it on thick, but you don't want to get so thick that you start masking all of the detail that's in there so that the darker paint can't seep in. The reason I'm using a white primer is because the gray I'm using is pretty dark, and when you put it next to black, it's sometimes indistinguishable. And so this white undercoat will really liven up this gray and let you see more of the details. Also, when we go to wash, it'll provide more contrast between the darkest parts in the recesses and the regular gray. So with the base primed, you just want to make sure that you got all the sides. You don't want any of that plain cork color sticking out. And don't worry about getting any primer on the base rim, that'll all be fixed later. So for our colors, we have our dark gray for the asphalt and the base color. We've got our medium gray, which is going to be for the rubble. And then we've got our light gray that'll be used to dry brush and highlight everything. So let's get started on painting our dark gray. So while painting the dark gray, it's important to do thin coats so that we don't cover up all of our details and the texture that the cork provides. It's actually okay to leave some of the white primer showing through our gray base coat, because when we apply our wash, it'll be lighter in the light areas and darker in the dark areas, providing more contrast. Another thing that you shouldn't worry about is getting gray paint on our wood, and later in the video I'll actually show you how that can be a benefit for us. So now it's important to move quickly here, and we're going to start doing our lighter gray on all of the rubble. The reason why we're moving quickly is because we're doing this while the dark gray is still wet, so that when the light gray bleeds down to our flat asphalt area, it provides us with an easy wet blend. It makes the transition from asphalt to rubble look more natural. So with our base coat of gray now finished, we're going to move on to painting the other details. We're going to start with the wood. And as I mentioned before, it's not a problem if you get some gray on your wood, because the gray under our thin coats of brown acts as knots and discolorations that you naturally see in wood all the time. And what's great is this effect is enhanced when we put our brown wash on it. So now we're going to move on to our razor wire, and it's very straightforward. Just taking extra care where the razor wire meets the base, and just making sure you don't get metal on the asphalt. Now with the razor wire finished, we're going to let everything on this base dry. And while everything's drying, now's a good time to paint our base rim. I always paint my base rims because it's the easiest way to make your miniatures look uniform with each other. And even when I didn't base my miniatures, I used to paint all my bases the same color so my units would look cohesive. And one tip while painting your base rims is to use multiple thin coats so that the sides of your base have a nice smooth finish. Now that our base coat of gray is dry, we're going to add even more contrast by painting the tops of our rocks the lightest gray. What this is achieving is a larger difference between our dark gray on our lower texture and our lightest gray on the top of our highest textures. When we apply our wash, the wash will enhance these color differences. So now with all of our gray dry, we're going to start washing. And I like to start washing in the most textured areas so that while my brush is heavily loaded with the wash, it can seep into those areas easily. Another thing to look out for is to make sure your wash isn't pooling on flat surfaces. It looks odd and unnatural when a raised flat surface is darker than some of your crevices. So just be sure to keep pushing that around with your brush into your textured areas. So with our base fully washed, you'll notice it looks really dark right now, so we're going to start with our highlighting. We're just going to grab that lightest color of gray that we have and wipe it off of our brush onto our paper towel, hence the name dry brushing, and just ensuring that our brush is lightly loaded with our color. Remember, it's easier to add more layers of our dry brush than to remove our dry brush from our recesses. So just come at it patiently with multiple layers until you get your desired effect. So I'm not just dry brushing the rubble, I'm also dry brushing the base asphalt area because it brings out the nice texture that the cork naturally has. It also provides an easy edge highlight on our raised asphalt areas, really adding some definition to the base. So here we are after one round of dry brushing. So we're going to hit it with a few more layers and we'll be back with the finished results. So here we are looking at 5 finished bases. So you can see here different variations that I've tried and that you can apply to your bases. An important thing to remember is to be able to fit your miniature on the base. With ornaments like the wood and the razor wire can sometimes be challenging to find a place to put their feet. So while constructing, just be sure to be placing your miniature on the base and making sure they have a natural place to stand. Another thing to consider is your time commitment to these bases. These are not quick bases by any means. It takes me about 45 minutes to build and paint one of these, where doing a classic dirt base, I can churn out about 50 of those in a day. If you're building an army with lots of miniatures, I would recommend doing a simpler base than these. I'm building these for my Chaos Space Marines, so I've only got about 70 of these to build. But if you're really determined, definitely go for it. Thanks for warhamming with me. As always, check out my other videos, and I'll see you in the next one.